Hey there, everyone. It's Lee. I am going to go through this. This is part one. I did the intro on Periscope. Let's just go through and set the background for this. The things I want to draw a parallel between are what happened in Ukraine in 2014 when protest and civil unrest that began in November 2013 toppled the government, to what we're seeing right now and to what I saw when I was here in Washington in 2017, which is after the inauguration, massive protest in the streets. Now, the parallel here is we're talking about the Euromaidan coup that happened in 2013 and 2014, where Viktor Yanukovych, who was the democratically elected, and he was corrupt, let's just go with that, he was corrupt, but he was democratically elected and he was thrown out in a coup, and it was fomented by people like George Soros and assisted by programs put into place by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who of course was running against Donald Trump. Now, there's lots of echoes here. These pictures are all from the U.S., right? We saw it in the run-up where the U.S. political system was under organized attack, with groups funded by George Soros and promoted by Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. As we go through this, you're going to see how the Ukrainians fit into this and into the current Trump-Russia narrative. That's it for this video. We'll see you on the next one. This is Lee Stranahan. In part one of the video, we sort of set up a broad outline of what we're going to be showing you. Let's start to go through the timeline a little bit. But there's a lot of material here. Don't get confused by it. We're going to go over some of this material again. So some of them I'm going to go through quickly, but let's just start to go through this first slide in the timeline. As we mentioned, in February 2014, the Obama administration helped to engineer a coup in the Ukraine funded by George Soros. Now, significantly, in April of 2014, right after the coup, the Obama administration announced a U.S. crisis support package for the Ukraine. And I got a couple things here. This is the White House's own site, fact sheet, U.S. crisis support package for the Ukraine. And here's from the Kiev Post, crisis support package. Among other things, it mentions, economics, rule of law, but they mention rule of law and anti-corruption. This is one of the things that they established early. And this is really significant, as you're going to see soon, okay? Now cut to 2016. In February of 2016, the FBI sets up a permanent office at the newly created National Anti-Corruption Bureau of the Ukraine for the execution of international requests. Now, NABU plays a big part in the election of 2016 and the Trump-Russia narrative involving Paul Manafort, as we'll show you in the next video. Third slide. And the reason why is I want to make sure that this is connected to events you're aware of. A lot of this stuff I'm going to show you on slide 2 here is stuff that happened in the background you aren't aware of. But what you are aware of, so let's just skip to slide 3 for a second. You remember that in August of last year, during the election, Paul Manafort is the chairman of the Trump campaign. And on August 14th, the group that we talked about in part 2, the FBI created Ukrainian anti-corruption group, announces that Manafort's name appeared in a secret ledger and he got in cash payments. Within days, Manafort is out. Okay? Now, that's an impact on the election. The Trump campaign chairman being forced to resign over this is a big start to the Trump-Russia narrative, and it had a definite impact on things that happened. In the next video, I'm going to go back to slide 2 and show you what, some of the things that led up to that, just some of them. But let me point out that this is really important, that after the election, after Trump won, which he was not expected to do, June 27th, the of this year, just a couple months ago, The anti-corruption prosecutor who made this announcement says that Manafort's name was not in the ledger showing as getting cash payments, and that he's not under investigation. So in other words, after the election, they were forced to take back. This is a false story pushed by this National Anti-Corruption Bureau that's connected to the FBI. I just want you to see that this had an effect on the election, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video. Okay, in the last video, we went to the events of the election you're aware of. That, for instance, this is from the New York Times. August 19th, Paul Manafort quit. And if you just scroll down not too far, it'll say the waiver reports about Manafort's own business dealings with Russian-aligned leaders in Ukraine, including allegations of millions of dollars in cash payments. But what we know now is that on June 27th of this year, in a story that was almost just completely buried by the media, Bloomberg is one of the only people that covered it, they admitted that there's no evidence of those illicit payments. And we know that those that announcement came from a group that was set up by the FBI, right? That's what we talked about here. Now let's go back. What happened before that you weren't aware of, okay? So what happened to set that up was in March 15th, a DNC operative named Alexandra Chalupa, who we'll be talking a lot about, began to meet with Ukrainian officials to discuss Paul Manafort. August 27th, she spoke with a group of 68 Ukrainian journalists about Manafort at this group, the Open World Leadership Center, which, by the way, was set up by George Soros. He's one of the people who helped found it. He was on the board of directors, at least, early on. And later, June 29th, again, this is during the election, the FBI and NABU announced that they are going to cooperate in investigations. In other words, when this announcement's made, there's no way the FBI doesn't know anything about it. They have to know about it because they had already been set up and they announced that they were going to be cooperating. There's somebody in the office. So that's a little bit of the background. Let's start to go through some of this stuff in more detail in the next video. Okay, here in part 5, I'd like to pause and just do another quick overview of the whole issue and discuss the idea of what the Ukrainian interference in the American election looked like. We've heard a lot about the Trump-Russia narrative, as I'm going to show you that Trump-Russia narrative was actually created by Ukrainian advisors of Hillary Clinton. But what's clear is the Ukrainian government colluded directly with the Democrats to interfere in the 2016 election. Again, I'm not proving this here. Let's just go over the broad story, okay? DNC operative Alexandra Chalupa coordinated with Ukrainian officials to discredit the Trump campaign and to drive the false Trump-Russia narrative. I'm going to talk more about who Alexandra Chalupa is in the next video. Chalupa coordinated with Ukrainians, official government people in Ukraine, and American journalists who were chosen by the embassy in Kiev and colluded with them at the Open World Leadership Center, then bragged to the DNC about it. Chalupa also worked with convicted bomber and leftist activist Brett Kimberlin. I'll talk more about that much later. Ukraine publicly opened an investigation and released the secret ledger, which we talked about last time. Manafort was forced to resign, and then they said that it didn't actually show that at all way after the election. So there's a quick overview of the Ukrainian interference in the election. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about Alexandra Chalupa, the DNC operative, who is really one of the people at the center of this. But before I do that, I'm going to mention this article that was published in Politico in January of this year, called Ukrainian Efforts to Sabotage Trump Backfire. Kiev officials are scrambling to make amends with President-elect after quietly working to boost Clinton. This article by Ken Vogel and David Stern, not right-wing, not Republicans, not Trumpers, This article is sort of the Rosetta Stone of a lot of this stuff. And a lot of the information, I cannot stress enough, you need to read this article. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about Alexandra Chalupa is in there. So who is she? She's a former Clinton White House official. She worked in the Clinton White House. Longtime DNC consultant, been a consultant since 2004. She created the opposition research file about Paul Manafort. You can see that in the Vogel article. She coordinated with the Ukrainian officials about Manafort. Again, that's in the Vogel article. One of her sisters, Andrea Chalupa, has said that Alexander was running Trump-Russia research for the DNC on 2 different occasions, actually. Here's 2 different tweets from Andrea Chalupa. My sister led Trump-Russia research at DNC. That's pretty clear. And a few days ago, my sister, who was harassed for investigating Trump-Russia, experienced some serious tech glitch. We'll come back to that in a little bit because it's very significant to note that Alexandra Chalupa later denied that she was doing that to CNN. You'll see that later. Her other sister, Irina Chalupa, works for a group funded by Soros. And Irina Chalupa is also part of the Atlantic Council, another important organization that we'll talk about later in this video series. Now, at this point, I would like to briefly introduce a number of other people who are important to understand in this whole thing, but I just want to go through them quickly. These are people that connect between the Ukrainians and the DNC, and they also connect in every one of these cases to the Atlantic Council. Again, we mentioned them briefly last time. We'll talk about them more coming up. Milan Verveer, ex-State Department official. She's a very close Hillary Clinton ally, has worked with her. She's on the board of directors of the Atlantic Council, and she's Ukrainian-American. By the way, she worked with Alexandra Chalupa on an event. You'll see her name mentioned in that Politico article. This is Viktor Pinchuk. He's a Ukrainian billionaire, close friend of Bill Clinton's. He's also a trustee at the Atlantic Council and an ally of George Soros, who's pictured here. Of course, Soros is the Hungarian-born billionaire, major funder for the Ukrainian Maidan Revolution, major donor to the Atlantic Council, and he, of course, was Hillary Clinton's top 2015 individual contributor. Finally, here's Evelyn Farkas. We'll talk about her later. You may have remember her in relationship to the Susan Rice unmasking story. Evelyn Farkas is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and she worked under Hillary Clinton as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, which means she's very familiar with Ukrainian issues. So these are a few more people to keep in mind in this big cast of characters. This is Lee Stranahan. With the media obsessively focused on Donald Trump's supposed connection to Russia, looking for that, I just want to point out that when I say Hillary Clinton's connected to the Ukraine, you're going to see this is not picked at random, it's major. Many of her top allies and advisors are Ukrainian. This includes close friends, and the Clinton Foundation's largest donations come surprisingly from the Ukraine. Let's look at some videos, some web pages here. This is Adam Parkhomenko. He's the Clinton staffer who's devoted his life to her cause. He's a Ukrainian-American. I've been sparring with him on Twitter, and he's the one who set up the Ready for Hillary PAC that raised tens of millions of dollars. We've already talked about Alexandra Chalupa. This Yahoo article calls her one of the 16 people who saved the 2016 election. But the really big connections are with people like Viktor Pinchuk. Here's an article from Newsweek saying Hillary Clinton's big benefactor, that's Viktor Pinchuk, has trade links with Iran. Or this one talking about her foreign friends. Now, when we talk about the donations, this is significant. If you had to guess who donated the most money to the Clinton Foundation, you wouldn't guess Ukraine, probably. It's a small country. You don't think of it as a big donor on stuff like this, but there it is. This is from the Wall Street Journal. The other person we mentioned last time, but let's just be clear on this, is Milan Verveer, forgive me. Milan Verveer shares family connections right here, there's Milan Verveer. This is her listed with Hillary as Hillary Clinton's inner circle on the Wall Street Journal, along with, you know, Chelsea and Bill and Milan. She's a big one there. Also, forgive me, at Georgetown, she and Hillary have this Global Women's Issues Institute that's been set up. She was actually a chief of staff. She goes back years and years with the Clintons. She was a chief of staff in the Clinton administration for Hillary Clinton. So she's as connected as you can be. So there you go. That is Hillary's Ukraine connections, not minor, big stuff. Now is as good a time as any to introduce another really important character, and that is this guy right here. You remember him from these slides here and here, Sergei Leschenko. Sergei Leschenko is a Ukrainian politician and journalist who features prominently in this story. It's fair to say that he's obsessed with Manafort. Stay tuned for a minute. I'm going to show you a story the mainstream media you're not hearing about Sergei Leschenko, because you've never heard of him, right? Because the media doesn't talk about him. He's very significant. As I mentioned in these slides, he was the one who was behind this ledger that has now, remember, this is the same ledger that led to Manafort's resignation, where Leschenko said he was paid these cash payments. Manafort resigns. Then after the election, the Anti-Corruption Bureau says, no, that's not accurate. Leschenko's the guy behind that. He's also somebody who met with Alexandra Chalupa. He told Fox News that he met with Chalupa. I believe it may have been at this meeting with 68 journalists, although I don't know that for sure, but it seems likely to me, since that's a lot of Ukrainian journalists to come over. Remember, these people were handpicked by the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. Now, when I say obsessed with him, for instance, here's an article from April 2017. And there's Leschenko. And he's now, again, he's a politician. He revealed an invoice with Manafort's letterhead. So he's the one making this. But when I say obsessed, here's the story you don't really hear about. He attempted to blackmail Paul Manafort, according to Manafort. You know, Manafort's been made a villain. You don't hear that Manafort's daughter was hacked. Her emails were hacked. Text stolen. Gee, that's a hacking. Who do you think behind that? I don't think it's the Russians. And that's the story you don't hear about. So this is Sergei Leschenko. He met with Chalupa. He's the one pushing for this. And by the way, he used to work for a TV channel owned by Viktor Pinchuk, who we've talked about in the last couple of videos. Now, we've spent a few videos going over a few different people and connections between the Hillary Clinton camp and Ukraine, but I want to point out something here, that the Ukrainian connections actually help explain something that's been puzzling to people, which is why the absolute obsession with Russia. Why have we spent months and months and months going after Russia? And understanding these Ukrainian connections helps explain it. Let's go a little bit deeper. You know, we already mentioned Alexandra Chalupa, and we mentioned her sister Andrea, by the way, both of whom have me blocked on Twitter. But it's important to understand that Alexandra and Andrea Chalupa were involved back in 2013 and 14 with the Euromaidan revolution. Remember this? They were involved with it. They set up something called the Digital Maidan. Here's a great article. George Eliason has done a lot of good work at WashingtonBlog.com. He makes a great point here that every article neglects to mention that Chalupa and her family are not Democrats. Instead, they're ultranationalists who wants to send the United States at war with Russia. And this is true. Alexandria and Andrea Chalupa started what's called the Digital Maidan. Now, again, Eliason's a critic of theirs. By the way, Andrea Chalupa is a writer in New York. She helped launch online video for Condé Nast, for AOL, right? So she's not an insubstantial person. This is Ukrainian Weekly, ukweekly.com, and it goes over the Digital Maidan. These are nationalist Ukrainians. And it mentions leading the efforts were, among other people, Andrea Chalupa, Alexandra Chalupa. And it said the Digital Madon was basically an American way of helping out. And I want you to notice one other thing here. They talk about protesters across the country. You may have missed this. One of the places people protested here was in New Britain. By the way, that's Paul Manafort's hometown. You may not know this, but Manafort's father was the mayor of New Britain, Connecticut. And Connecticut's going to play a role later. You're going to see it